Exactly. Okay, so now that we see the system, we see the benefits of the system, we've been introduced to this really unique ant, social insect. The first thing that I'd like to then move to is the social living, the evolution of social living, which is something you discussed in a Nature paper in 2018. And it's again not it's something that I think a lot of people, we realize that we're social animals. We understand this. You hear it in popular science stuff all the time. Human cooperation, that's been our successful trait. But we often make the comparison to chimpanzees or great apes or other social living mammals. But if we wanted to look at the evolution of social living, group living, it might make sense to look at something a little more, I don't know if ancient is the right word, but social insects could give us a good understanding of how that dynamic evolved and what are the benefits and trade-offs to evolving as a group living species. Am I on the right trail here?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, social living, of course, as human, we think of it as, we are the most sophisticated social creatures, right? We like to, that's kind of a natural thing to think. Because we have, I mean, yeah, we have pretty complex social life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think some traits are uniquely human. But when you think of the animal kingdom, um, widely, I would say many people agree actually that social insects have pushed it arguably a little bit further than us
Mm-hmm.
in many ways, right? Um, and what's quite interesting there is that they are extremely successful as well, social insects as a group, right? I think the numbers are they represent only 2% of insect species, but they account for over 50% of the total insect biomass.
Wow.
So they are really super dominant, and they kind of really, in just sheer biomass, they dominate many ecosystems, especially in the tropics. Of course, they are very small, so we don't really know. You can live a whole life without really paying attention to them,
Mm-hmm.
but they are there and they do extremely well. So, um, yeah. So in that sense, I would say there are many independent evolutions of social life, and they, of course, in our groups, so in primates and so on. But social insects have done it over and over again, and also extremely successfully, but in a slightly different way than we have, right? So,
Right.
like for example, they have evolved this reproductive division of labor that we don't have. But in many ways, then kind of when you look at social insect colonies in terms of like their size, for example, and their success, they are comparable to human societies, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what were the questions then that you were looking at? Because it seemed, if I understood the paper correctly going through it, there was a question of what would be the initial payoff, or there might be an initial hurdle to overcome in terms of benefit that an organism would get from social living that maybe evolutionary theory wouldn't really predict. I'm trying to think of a better way maybe to explain that for the audience. But the benefits of social living might not be obvious, so it's maybe peculiar that it was selected for in the early stages. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, that's it. And so essentially, what's impressive about social insects is, those really elaborate, super complex forms, like colonies that contain millions of individuals, those super large queens, and so on. But that's a pretty derived traits evolutionarily. And so things must have started in smaller groups and before these very elaborate forms of division of labor, right? And so really what we set out to do is to use the clonal radar ant, which doesn't have this, crazy morphological specialization, which doesn't have queens, which um, all individuals look more or less the same. We know they have the ability to, everybody can do everything in those groups. And so what we set out to do is to ask um, whether division of labor could arise in those groups, and also at which group size it could emerge, right?
Mm.
So, because initially, of course, social groups were not composed of millions of individuals. They had to start small and they had to start simple. So, what we wanted to see was whether, very simply, it could emerge almost spontaneously in very small groups of individuals that are near identical in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and we thought the clonal gradient, well, it's one of the few systems that actually allows you to do that, because you can make groups of slightly different size very easily. And you can make sure that group size is the only thing that varies, right? It's not like the bigger groups have more genetic diversity, or it's not that the bigger groups have more variation in age, because this could explain, more division of labor through other mechanisms that simply coming together and forming those small groups that become slightly larger over time.
Okay. So the real testing variable then is group size, initial group size.
That was the focus. We wanted to see, and we measured so what we call fitness. We measured how well those groups did, because we wanted to also be able to have a readout. So we varied group size, and we quantify how that affected division of labor, and also performance, right? And we really saw that those things came in hand.
Okay. So what was the performance metric? How do you measure the performance of a small ant group?
Yeah, so as in biology in general, success is how many genes you pass on. So it's like reproduction and survival. So those are the two things that we measured, and then you can combine them to in some kind of colony growth rate, which measures how well an individual does on average in a small group versus a large group. And we could see that really both, so those benefits of increasing group size kicked in extremely early, actually earlier than we thought. And so we showed that groups that contain really as little as 6 ants had division of labor, and also did much better than colonies of like 2 ants or 1 ant.
Wow. Okay. So there was a benefit right away, even at 6 ants, to you're going to have a higher fitness. They're going to start saying, you're going to do this job, we're going to do this job. So does it say something about, is the benefit then, because this is, I think, the other question is it division of labor? Is it that they can do things more efficiently? Are they, is there, like, what is it about then this group living that is so, that makes it more successful?
Yeah, that's really the core question, right? So when group living arises, you almost always see some form of division of labor. It's not only true for group living, but it's also true for, the evolution of multicellularity, for example, which is also an example where small units get together and form a larger entity, really, that is functionally integrated. And so the idea is really division of labor is at the core of those elaborations of life, right, into more complex units, and that this is the true evolutionary advantage, that it provides an advantage that is so large that it promotes, in this case, the evolution of social life. But how exactly that happens is still kind of an open question. And so I think in that 2018 study, we could really show that those things came together, and we propose an idea like that comes from our own data, for example, but we couldn't really causally demonstrate that increasing division of labor causally improves fitness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because, we manipulated group size, not the behavior directly. But that's a kind of experimentalist, maybe nitpicking here.
Yeah.
But so what you see essentially is that, so the advantages, the benefits of division of labor could come about via different mechanisms, at least, in principle. One is that if you're a specialist, you can become better at what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Either through learning or experience and so on. It's also possible that even without being better at a job, the simple fact that you don't waste time switching between tasks improves efficiency at the level of the group, right? You don't have to constantly move from one job to the other, and you don't waste time moving between those tasks. And what we observed actually also in our own ant colonies in that experiment is that there was an advantage in the sense that as soon as you reach a certain group size, the likelihood that one of the jobs that you have to do is neglected, is abandoned, like no one does it, that decreases significantly. So in our case, we looked at, for example, the likelihood that the larvae were unattended for, and that be quite that I think that can be quite intuitive for parents, for example, that if you leave your young unattended for a while, they might fight with each other. So like those ant larvae, for example, are prone to eating each other even. And so we found that as groups became larger, and for the same amount of work per individual, the likelihood that the larvae were not attended for decreased. And so it could be that simply in larger groups, you become better at performing all the tasks at a sufficient level all the time, rather than having those kind of large fluctuations. It's hard for a single individual, for example. You simply cannot do all the tasks at the same time, so you have to switch by definition. And as soon as you have two individuals, maybe you can, one stays home with the larvae, the other one goes out to forage and so on, and those effects seem to really scale up as group size increases.